I'm going to read a poem now by Seamus Heaney called Digging. And I chose this poem because it was a favorite of my aunt, Anne McDonough Moore, who passed away this last October. She was my godmother, and I loved her very much. And so I'm reading this in her memory. Digging. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father, digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once, I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
I am going to start off here with a poem by a poet named Cathal Magillaguna, who was a 17th century poet who wrote in Irish and who was apparently a bit of a wild man and a rake. This poem gives a little bit of a sense of that. And really, it's a song that is sung in Irish to this day, still is sung in Irish. And but what Seamus Heaney took this song and translated it as a poem. And this is his translation. It's called An Bonan Bui, the Yellow Bittern. Yellow bittern, there you are now, skin and bone on the frozen shore. It wasn't hunger, but thirst for a mouthful that left you foundered and me heartsore. What odds is it now about Troy's destruction, with you on the flagstones upside down, who never injured or hurt a creature and preferred bog water to any wine? Bittern, bittern, your end was awful. Your perished skull there on the road, you that would call me every morning with your gargler's song as you guzzled mud. And that's what's ahead of you, and that's what's ahead of your brother Cathal. You know what they say about me and the stuff. But they've got it wrong, and the simple truth is that a drop would have saved that croaker's life. I am saddened, bittern, and broken-hearted to find you in scrags in the rushy tufts, and the big rats scampering down the rat paths to wake your carcass and have their fun. If you could have got word to me in time, bird, that you were in trouble and craved a sup, I'd have struck the fetters of those loch waters and have wet your thrapple with the blow I struck. Your common birds do not concern me, the blackbird, say, or the thrush or crane, but the yellow bittern, my heartsome namesake, with my looks and locks, he's the one I mourn. Constantly he was drinking, and by all accounts, I've a name for it too. But every drop I get, I'll sink it, for fear I might get my end of the druth. The woman I love says to give it up now, or else I'll go to an early grave. But I say no and keep resisting, for taking drink's what prolongs your days. You saw for yourselves a while ago what happened the bird when its throat went dry. So my friends and neighbors, let it flow. You'll be stood no rounds in eternity.
This is actually not a poem, a short story, and very short. And it's by a gentleman named Robert Brennan. He was born in 1881 and died in 1964. And he's actually a novelist, and he was involved in the uprising, and later on he worked for Radio Éireann, and he was from 1937 to 1948 minister for Ireland to the United States. And it's a cute little story here. And I had traveled to Dublin for an examination, and I was met at the railway station by three Wexford friends of mine, John Maloney, his brother Peter, and Fred Cogley, all students. They were all staying at the same digs in Portobello, and they had arranged for me to stay there also. We were hardly well inside the house when the three of them rushed to the front room crying, "Here she is." I joined them and saw a very good-looking girl. She came up the steps of the house and entered, and the attentions of all three of them were transferred to the doorway through which she could be seen tripping lightly up the stairs. They said to me, "Isn't she grand?" I agreed and asked what she was like. "Well, haven't you seen her for yourself?" "But what is she like to talk to?" They didn't know. They had never spoken to her because they had not been introduced. She was a lodger like themselves. Her name was Kiernan, and she was a native of Carlow. I thought it strange that in the course of several weeks, they were unable to strike up an acquaintance. They wanted to know how. "Well," I suggested, "you could, for instance, run up the stairs when she's coming down and bump into her and beg your pardon, and there you are." "But," said Peter, "what could we talk to her about?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe if you get talking to her, you could think of something." I suddenly remembered she was from Carlow. Why not talk about Carlow? They knew nothing about Carlow. Did I? "The only thing I know about it," I said, "is that they have electric light there." At the time, Carlow was the only provincial town in Ireland so blessed. The next day, I left the library and walked up into Grafton Street. What was my amazement when I saw Peter Maloney on the opposite side of the street, standing, talking to Miss Kiernan, or rather, he was standing looking at her, his round, fair, innocent face like the rising sun. When he saw me, he sent out signals of distress, and I joined him and was introduced. This is Mr. Brennan, Miss Kiernan." I looked at her and saw the bluest eyes I had ever beheld. They were paralyzing, and I managed to say, "How do you do?" "I'm well, thanks," she said, and she was blushing too. I made a violent effort to concentrate. "It's a fine day," I said. "Yes," she replied. Then I tried in vain to think of any further word in English, Irish, or any other language. The silence was solid. At last I blurted out, "What way are you going?" She she indicated the direction of Stephen's Green. That way, she said. So am I. The three of us walked towards Stephen's Green. I tried to think of something to say, and Peter's obvious embarrassment did not help me. At last, I had an idea. Of course, I could not know that Peter had said it already. I understand, I said, that you are from Carlow, Miss Kiernan. Yes. I saw now that Peter had already said it, but it was too late to draw back. I believe, I said, and there was desperation in my voice, that you have electric light there. Yes. We entered Harcourt Street without another word. The perspiration was rolling off me. It was clear that what Peter was saying to himself should have blasted me from the earth. We were halfway up Harcourt Street when we saw Cogley coming down. I thanked God. He stopped and was introduced. How do you do? He said. And I was horror-stricken to see that her eyes had the same effect on him. I'm well, thanks. He managed to say, it's a fine day. Yes. After a very long pause, he said, I think I'll go back with you. And the four of us walked on. The silence was now fourfold. Of course, Fred got the same idea. I saw it dawning in his mind, and I kicked him. That only spurred him on. I believe, Miss Kiernan, he said, that you come from Carlow. Yes. He knew now, it was evident from the quiver in his voice. I understand, he said. You have electric light there. Yes. It was terrible. There was not a word spoken till we turned into Lennox Street. John Maloney was sitting on the steps of the house. I hastened on in front. John, I said in a tragic whisper, don't say anything about electric light in Carlow. And aloud he said, what about electric light in Carlow? She heard him and she passed indoors, her head held high. She never looked at any of us again. That's it.
My poem is by Paul Durcan. Paul was born in Dublin in 1944. He attended University College Cork, where he studied archaeology and history. And he won the Patrick Kavanagh Award in 1974. And then in 1983, he toured Russia at the invitation of the Union of Soviet Writers. In 85, he was a resident poet at the Frost Place in New Hampshire. At present, he lives in Cork. And the poem of his that I'm reading is called Tulino, a tete-a-tete in the parish priest's parlor. He was a grand man. He was. He fell out of the train going to Sligo. He did. He thought he was going to the lavatory. He did. In fact, he stepped out the rear door of the train. He did. God, he must have got an awful fright. He did. He saw that it wasn't the lavatory at all. He did. He saw that it was the railway tracks going away from him. He did. I wonder if, but he was a grand man. He was. He had the most expensive Toyota you can buy. He had. Well, it was only beautiful. It was. He used to have an Audi. He had, as a matter of fact, he used to have 2 Audis. He had. And then he had an Avenger. He had. And then he had a Volvo. He had, in the beginning, he had a lot of Volksies. He had. He was a grand man for the Volksies. He was. Did he once have an escort? He had not. He had a son, a doctor. He had. And he had a Morris Minor too. He had. He had a sister, a hairdresser in Killamollock. He had. Yeah. He had another sister, a hairdresser in Ballybunion. He had. Yeah. He was put in a coffin, which was put in his father's cart. He was. His lady wife sat on top of the coffin, driving the donkey. She did. But he was a grand man. He was a grand man. Well, good night, Father. Good night, Mary.
Okay, I am going to read a poem called The Banshee's Grotto, and it's by John O'Donoghue, who was born in 1956 and in West Ireland and died in 2008. He was a poet, author, priest, philosopher, and he left the priesthood in 2000 and became an environmental activist who founded the Burren Action Group. The Banshee's Grotto is based on is after a photograph by Fergus Bork, which I want to see if I can show you. Whoops, wait a minute, maybe it needs to have, can you see it? Okay, looks like you can see it. Okay. Okay, The Banshee's Grotto by John O'Donoghue. The messenger comes from that distant place beside us where we cannot remember how unlikely it is that we are here. Keepers of interiors not our own, strangers in whom dawn and twilight are one. When the black door opens, she often appears, keeping her distance from the house of grief, circling it with her cry until her tears have cut a path to the nerve of a name that will soon stand alone on a headstone. No one has seen her face or can fathom why she comes so far to mourn a stranger. She is no Rachel weeping for her children, no Cassandra doomed to remain unheard. She is the first voice from the other world. It seems the camera's eye caught her form hunched inside a waterfall in Milray. Is it there she collects tears of delight, sure that death is bright? Or worn down with grief, must she drink from her Connemara lathe